Radio 970 KBUL, Tommy B in the Bulletin. Imagine just 2 credits short of graduating from college. You join the Florida National Guard to pay for your tuition, eagerly exchanging 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year for a free education. Now imagine it's fall 2002. You've just gotten married. You're on your honeymoon cruise. Imagine checking your email on ship and get your last semester grades, find out you've been called to active duty. You're shipping out to the Middle East, bud. And then, you'll be back in 3 months. No, more than a year later, you and your unit still patrolling the streets of Baghdad. You've been in Iraq longer than any other group of U.S. soldiers. Now, this is the story of John Crawford. His unit crossed into Iraq at the front lines of the invasion, pushed through Nasiriyah, then spent months upon months occupying Baghdad. Between patrols, Crawford started writing nonfiction stories about what he and his fellow soldiers witnessed and experienced. At the urging of a journalist embedded with his unit, he began sending those pieces out of the country via an anonymous internet email account. Those stories became this book, the last true story I'll ever tell. It's an accidental soldier's account of war in Iraq. I'm delighted to have the author, John Crawford, on the show. John, good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
What a great book. What a great life. I'm serious. I got to tell you, I'm disturbed and elated at the same time because these are not easy things to hear and read.
No, they're not. And a lot of that goes to the state I was in, of course, when I wrote them. Some of them were written in Iraq, like you said, and then some immediately after I came home, and that's a difficult transition in and of itself. And yeah, it was just such a bleak time that it comes out in the book, I think, very well.
It does. It had to be a bleak thing to do. Now, to start with, you volunteer because you're a National Guard guy. So, even though there's a lot of bitching and moaning going on, you don't feel like you are one of those guys. You're gonna suck it up. But you're seeing everybody else go home heroes, and you keep getting delayed. I mean, how did that feel?
Well, yeah, and we had volunteered in my unit. The Florida National Guard pays 100% tuition, and so from platoon sergeant on down, I mean, we had a ridiculous amount of experience that I never saw. I was in the 101st before that, and you never saw that kind of experience in any other unit. I mean, everyone from platoon sergeant on down almost was Ranger qualified and was a Ranger regiment or 82nd or 10th Mountain or 101st, and so there wasn't a lot of complaining. But our order said until completion of mission, and once the invasion kind of stalled, and it was mid-April, and things the country had been defeated, Iraq had. We redeployed back to Nasiriyah, and the 3rd ID guys and the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force guys and everyone that we had been attached to was cleaning their equipment and turning in ammunition, and we started doing likewise. And you get to call home for the first time, and they're planning parades, and the governor's going to come speak, and this huge thing. And then one morning about 3 a.m, they woke us up, and we marched down to the tarmac, and they drove down and they reissued ammunition and said, "Well, you're going to Baghdad." And the reason was that the active duty units were more likely to redeploy faster than the National Guard units, and this was going to be our only time going overseas, and that was the reason. Of course, my National Guard unit, I've since got out, but they're in Afghanistan right now, so it didn't work out so well.
Yeah, for sure. Now, you were on one of the initial pushes. You make a reference in the book to the young supplies, the lady who was captured. That wasn't Jessica, was it?
Yeah, Jessica Lynch. Yeah,
it really was. Okay.
Yeah, the young maintenance female. Yeah, that was. Yeah, we. And it was a random. The next, they woke us up and all right, well, we're going to go kick in some doors. Every soldier I think around was looking, and nobody really had any idea where to look. But we went through Nasiriyah and looked in some houses and stuff like that, and of course didn't find anything.
Yeah, you did come upon a weapons cache, didn't you?
In Nasiriyah, yeah, we came upon a huge weapons cache. Just warehouses full of stuff, and of course the irony is half of it's like AT-4s and American weapons that we had provided in the 80s when they were fighting the Iran-Iraq war. But unfortunately, because of the nature of the invasion going so fast and with only 150,000 soldiers or so in the invasion force, we secured it for as long as we were there, which was difficult. That was only with a platoon, and this was a big post. And so basically we would chase down the locals who would try to steal the weapons of the insurgents, because they did have an insurgency in Nasiriyah that early, just a few days into the war. And but after that was over, the invasion force is going to keep moving north, and we just kept moving north and had to leave it.
You talk about in the preface of the book, John. You mentioned the journalists who walk around with the pans. You walk around with a machine gun, and then you make a reference later on about how there's cameras and journalists that want to catch Americans, mistreating Iraqi locals. They're really just looking for an opportunity, it sounds like, the way you describe it.
And of course, when I wrote it, I had, that was a journalist that I met that I showed my story to, and he took it to New York and showed it to an agent. So, and he's a good friend of mine. And since then, I made friends with some and changed a little bit of my opinion of them. But there are, everyone's telling a story. And I think what most people look past is they're usually living in a tiny apartment in Brooklyn that they can't afford.
Yeah.
And they're working for an editor who lives in a tiny apartment in Manhattan that he can't afford. And so they're telling the story that their producers want, and they're putting spins on it, and a lot of times. And so we did get news guys who were really itching to get you to do something stupid, and you had other guys who, you could do anything you wanted, and they weren't going to report it.
Yeah.
So it just all kind of depended. And now, you don't get any of that really, because nobody can leave the Palestine hotel. The journalists can't even. The security isn't there for them to go around the country.
Because it's just not safe, or because they're not allowed?
Oh, it's not safe at all.
Yeah.
They have to either be super embedded, and because the story here that's not being told is you're not being able to talk to our Iraqi people. We're hearing what you're getting very, very censored views in a lot of cases, and whether it's positive or negative, it's not really a true story because these journalists, they run outside of the Palestine hotel and take a picture, something blows up, but aside from that, they're literally gangs of people that drive around that'd be happy to snatch a journalist off the street and cut off his head. That went on for a while, and it stopped. It didn't stop because they quit. It stopped because the journalists no longer go anywhere.
Right. Well, and you make two stories out of some locals that interested me a great deal. One was the girl, Lee. I can't remember her name now.
Lena. Yeah.
Lena. And you never found out what happened to Lena?
The rumor was that she went to go live with her uncle or her cousin or something. We never saw her again after her house was burned down.
Yeah, it was a really gripping story. And then you also tell about a shopkeeper that I found quite interesting. He was very friendly to some Americans, but apparently some of your guys didn't think the same as you did.
Well, his name was Wally, and he was I guess the equivalent, a very, very popular man in the sector within our little area or neighborhood, and very powerful among the locals. And I don't know quite what he did. It was very shady. He had some criminal stuff going on, you could certainly tell. But he was smart enough, to realize that if he made friends with us, then that we were the power in the sector now, same thing as bribing the police. So he had a little shop, and he had an air conditioner in there, or an air cooler, actually, and we would just sit in there, and he had a cooler, and he would send off his guys to go get you food and stuff like that. And it was kind of like a little break, to be able to hang out by Wally for a few minutes. And in exchange, whenever we would search houses, because we did that fairly regularly, go through every single house in the sector, it was usually my squad that searched his house. And if we found anything bad, we would have turned him in, but we didn't. We also didn't, tear through his house like we would have somebody else's.
Right.
But at some point, one of the guys in second platoon, a good friend of mine, went down there, and I guess Wally didn't feel like he was being treated as well as he should, and he mouthed off a little bit, and I guess resisted whatever they were doing, and they put his head through a window and then arrested him.
Wow. So what happened to him? Do you know?
No, I have no idea. I think they sent him. We used to send our prisoners. We only held prisoners for less than 24 hours. We'd bring them back and throw them in basically a little room with wire all around them, and didn't even talk to them. You drop food and water in there, and then the next morning, usually the MPs would come and take them out and take them. We always thought they were going to Basra, but I don't know, maybe that could have been a rumor.
Yeah. I'm talking to John Crawford. His book is The Last True Story I'll Ever Tell about his time in Iraq. When you mentioned the journalists and the spin and all of that kind of thing, yesterday we talked about Vietnam with a vet who talked a lot in his book and on the air with us about, the real world, they called it back then, the real world versus what they were going through. Did that spin come back to you when you're, hanging out in the sand?
As far as you mean, like watching the news on TV?
Yeah.
Or, in the invasion, of course, you're in a media vacuum. But once we got into Iraq and eventually got it set up with internet and phone and TV and stuff like that, you do see it. But the thing about being in and I can only say my experience being in Iraq, but I imagine the same with any war, is you pretty much don't like anyone who's not there. Nobody understands you feel. And so people always ask me, well, how do you feel about protests? How do you feel about this? I didn't like anybody back home because they weren't in Iraq sucking like I was.
Right.
And so, the media spin, you become very, very pessimistic. If it's on TV, you don't believe it, and of course it becomes easier to associate yourself with the conservative spins because at least they're telling you what a great job you're doing. But all in all, yeah, you just get very distrustful of media altogether.
Yeah. So, was it hard to do the job then?
No, it wasn't. I think a lot of people have the idea that soldiers kind of sit around, in a dusty hole discussing what's going on in the House of Representatives, and of course they don't. You sign a contract and you take an oath to obey the orders of the democratically elected leaders, and then that's it. And whether you agree with it or not, or whether you can talk politics all day, but your sphere of influence is so small as a light infantry soldier sitting on the ground that basically you do what you can around you, and if you try to help the locals and the 2 or 3 people you can, then that's what you do, and if not, that's also what you do. It's just the big picture never even really appears to you. Really?
So did that change when you came back?
It did. I watch a lot. I watch a lot of it, and it's upsetting, of course. And I do try to get a little bit more. Of course, I go on this book tour, and I go and speak at colleges and stuff like that, and I get asked the big picture questions where hey, tell us in 30 seconds, how we're going to get out of Iraq and deal with North Korea's thermonuclear missiles. And so I get questions like that, so you kind of have to look at the bigger picture and stuff.
Yeah. But you're probably in a better position to see that big picture, having been there and come back.
Yeah, it certainly adds a little bit to the understanding, and a little bit to, there was one the other day where this guy, supposedly, remember the attack that was going to happen in New York?
Right.
And they arrested him, and, they found a document that mentioned New York, which is, of course, the largest city in the world.
Yeah.
It didn't explain what kind of document. And this guy was supposed to drive all the way through Jordan, fly over to the United States, and then managed to procure, all sorts of explosives and munitions and do an explosion in New York City in the subway on Sunday. And he was arrested on Thursday in this tiny little crap town in south of Baghdad. And he was supposed to do all that in like 4 days. And, things like that. Once you've been over the ground as a soldier, you realize that's, you just kind of blow that off because that doesn't really sound like an accurate depiction of what happened.
Yeah. John, I love your book. It's as I mentioned before, there's some, I laughed out loud, by the way, with the whole motorcycle incident. That was just funny as it could be, but there's not that many laughs in it, frankly. How has your life been since you came back? I'm a little confused about the 2 endings of your book. I'm taking that one is basically a dream and the other one is the truth. Do I have that correctly?
The last chapter is actually the first story I wrote. It's a story that Christian Perenni, the journalist, picked up on, and it was written about what it was like to come home. And so the whole part, the middle scene in there where I'm in Nasiriyah is true. The 2 endpoints where I'm talking to my buddies, isn't, because obviously when I wrote it, I hadn't been home yet.
Okay.
That's the way. The point of that was that it was the last true story, and I don't want to tell that kind of a story again. But yeah, that wasn't actually what it was like coming home. I tried to kind of juxtapose that with what, even as a professional soldier who'd been doing it for years, what I thought it was going to be like coming home, and I was way off, of course, and so the last couple pages is actually more what it's like for me to come home.
All right. Well, people should pay twice what you're charging for the book just to read the last chapter.
Well, I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah. Well, I welcome you to the show, John. I pleased that you wrote the book, and I'm in awe of your service, and I thank you for serving.
Well, thanks for having me on the radio.
It's The Last True Story I'll Ever Tell. What a great read. An Accidental Soldier's Account of the War in Iraq from John Crawford.